In the summer of 1944, American tank crews were being burned alive inside vehicles the army had told them were good enough. The shells they fired bounced off German armour. The shells fired back went straight through. Crewmen had a name for what happened to them. They called it brewing up. It was not a metaphor, it was a verdict, and the men in Washington who could have prevented it had known for 2.5 years. This is the story of the engineer they silenced. The man whose weapon was ready, whose data was irrefutable, and whose warnings were ignored because a general with a theory believed tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks. That theory cost hundreds of American lives, and when it finally collapsed under the weight of German steel, the weapon he had built from the beginning was waiting. It began not in a factory or a firing range, but in a bureaucratic memo. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair was one of the most influential men in the wartime United States Army. He was not a tank man, he was a doctrine man, and his doctrine was simple, elegant, and catastrophically wrong. His belief was that tanks existed to exploit breakthroughs, to sweep through shattered infantry lines and race into undefended territory behind the enemy's collapsing front. Tanks should not fight other tanks. That task, in McNair's vision, belonged to a specialized force of fast-moving, lightly armored tank destroyers that would ambush enemy armor from prepared positions. They would lurk behind hedgerows and in tree lines. They would wait for the German armor to come forward. And when it did, they would emerge from concealment and destroy it before it could respond. It was a clean idea on paper. It was a death sentence in the Bockage. To protect his doctrine, McNair blocked the development of heavier tanks with heavier guns. He resisted every proposal to upgun the M4 Sherman. He told designers that the tank they had was sufficient for the roles it was intended to fill. He told generals in the field that the complaints they were hearing were exaggerated, that their crews were undertrained, that the problem was tactical rather than mechanical. His influence extended to the Army ground forces, the organization responsible for training and equipping the combat elements of the United States Army. And through that position, he shaped what was built, what were bought, and what reached the men in the field. He controlled the flow of equipment through sheer institutional gravity, and because he was a lieutenant general and because the army ran on hierarchy, the engineers fell silent. But silence is not agreement. It is just pressure applied to people who still know the truth. The M4 Sherman was a good tank. Let that be clearly stated, because what follows is not a simple condemnation of everyone involved in American armoured warfare. The Sherman was reliable. It was producible at a scale no other combatant nation could match. It was mechanically straightforward enough that a 19-year-old draftee with 6 weeks of training could learn to maintain it in field conditions. It ran on gasoline, it crossed bridges without collapsing them, and it could be shipped across an ocean in the kind of numbers that only American industrial capacity could sustain. These were real advantages. They mattered enormously for the logistics and strategy of a global war fought across 2 oceans. But the Sherman had been designed in a world where the German Panzer Mark III was the primary threat. That tank weighed roughly 22 tons. Its armour was manageable by the weapons American designers were planning around. Its gun was dangerous at close range but not dominant at any distance. By the time American boots hit the beaches at Normandy in June of 1944, the Germans had moved to a different category of machine entirely. And the men who built American procurement policy had not kept pace. The German Panther tank was a direct response to the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front. Its designers had studied what a well-sloped, well-gunned medium tank could do, and they had produced something formidable. The Panther carried a 75mm gun with a barrel so long it looked almost absurd, nearly 5 meters of rifled steel projecting from a well-sloped, heavily armoured turret. The muzzle velocity of that gun was significantly higher than anything the Sherman carried. At ranges beyond 1,000 meters, the Panther could punch through the front armour of a Sherman with grim certainty. The Sherman's 75mm gun, in return, could not reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armour at any practical combat distance. Crews who attempted it at dangerously close range and occasionally succeeded reported that success is an exception. And exceptions are not a weapon system. The Tiger I was worse. Its frontal armour was 100mm, thick, steeply set and nearly impervious to the standard American 75, at any range that meant anything in a real engagement. The Tiger was slower than the Panther, but it was a fortress on tracks, and it was not asking to be outmanoeuvred, it was asking to be destroyed, and the Sherman could not reliably do it from any practical direction except the rear, which required getting behind it first. American tank commanders in Normandy discovered all of this not through intelligence briefings but through experience. The kind of experience that kills men and then teaches the survivors. The mechanics of what a brewing up Sherman looked like were not academic. The gasoline-powered engine sat in the rear of the vehicle, and when a high-velocity round penetrated the hull and struck the fuel system, the result was almost instantaneous. The crew had seconds, sometimes fewer, to open the hatches and climb out. A Sherman had 5 crew members: the driver, the assistant driver, the loader, the gunner, and the commander. If the hatches jammed, if the fire spread faster than the mechanical release could be operated, if a crewman was wounded and could not move on his own, those seconds became irrelevant. Tank crews began carrying wire cutters and hammers inside the vehicle to force the hatches if the mechanism failed under heat. They painted the external surfaces of their escape hatches in bright colours so a wounded man could find them by touch in the dark and smoke of a burning interior. These were not the improvisations of panicked soldiers. They were the adaptations of men who'd been given an inadequate tool and were determined to survive inside it as long as the institution refused to give them a better one. Reports came back through the chain of command. Detailed reports, not vague complaints from frightened crews. Field commanders wrote that their vehicles were being destroyed by weapons they could not answer at ranges they could not close. They wrote that the Norman bockage terrain and the dense network of ancient hedgerows running along earthen embankments, channeling armour into narrow lanes and eliminating the possibility of flanking, had turned every approach into a frontal engagement. That the doctrine of tank destroyers ambushing enemy armour required concealment and a manoeuvre room that the bockage denied. That the Sherman was meeting panthers and tigers frontally in those hedgerow corridors and losing, with a consistency that could only be described as systemic. McNair called it a morale problem. He said the solution was better tactics and better crew training. The engineer said the solution was a 90mm gun. The 90mm gun had begun its life as an anti-aircraft weapon. The M1 anti-aircraft cannon fired a shell nearly 90mm in diameter at very high velocity, and the mathematics were not difficult to apply. If you could fire a projectile that large and that fast upward against fast-moving aircraft at altitudes measured in thousands of meters, you could certainly fire it horizontally against armoured steel at ranges measured in hundreds. The armour-piercing version of that projectile would carry enough kinetic energy to shatter the front plate of anything the Germans were currently fielding. This was not a speculative claim. It was a calculation that Army Ordnance specialists had been running and testing since 1942, with firing range results that supported it without ambiguity and without any need for revision. The problem was fitting the weapon into a ground vehicle. The M4 Sherman's turret ring was not large enough to accommodate a gun of that calibre, with the recoil mechanism it required. To mount a 90mm cannon properly, you needed a larger turret on a larger hull, and building a larger hull meant building a heavier tank, and building a heavier tank violated McNair's entire doctrine of mobility and mass production. The system was self-sealing against the solution it needed most. So the first application of the 90mm gun in a ground combat vehicle was not a tank at all. It was classified as a tank destroyer, a designation that would later prove significant in how long the program was permitted to advance without provoking the full weight of doctrinal obstruction. The M36 Jackson, so named by the crews after the American Civil War General Stonewall Jackson, was not a small vehicle. It weighed approximately 28 tons. It rode on the lower hull and suspension of the M10 Wolverine, a tank destroyer already in service in the European theatre. But it carried a completely new turret, open-topped and wide, mounting the 90mm M3 cannon on a sturdy breech system engineered to handle the violent recoil of a high-velocity anti-armour round. The turret rotated a full 360 degrees. The gun elevated and depressed through angles useful across the range of engagements crews would encounter in European terrain, and most importantly, it fired a shell that could kill a Panther. Development had begun in earnest by 1942. The prototype was tested in 1943. The results on the firing range were unambiguous, and the failures were documented with the precision that Army Ordnance testing required. At 1,000 metres, the 90mm armour-piercing round penetrated well over 100mm of vertical steel plate. Against the Panther, at likely combat ranges, the numbers said the duel was winnable for the first time. Against the Tiger I, the heavy frontal armour remained a challenge even for the 90mm at longer distances, But the side armour of both vehicles was now thoroughly vulnerable, and a weapon that could reliably kill from the flanks at any range a trained crew could identify was a weapon that changed the tactical calculus of every engagement. The Army Ordnance Department pushed the YEBD program forward. McNair's doctrinal establishment pushed back. The argument was not about whether the weapon worked, it was about what the weapon represented. Approving a vehicle built around a 90mm gun was an admission that the Sherman 75 was insufficient. And admitting that the Sherman 75 was insufficient was admitting that the doctrine which had placed the Sherman at the centre of American armoured warfare was flawed at its foundation. Bureaucracies do not make that admission easily. They make it only when the cost of not making it becomes so undeniable that not even institutional authority can contain the evidence any longer. The M36 began reaching Europe in the autumn of 1944, more than 2 years after its development had demonstrated the viability of the 90mm platform. 2 years during which American tankers and tank destroyer crews had fought with the weapons they had against armour they could not consistently penetrate from the front. 2 years of a solution sitting in development files while the problem was being measured in lives on the battlefield. Measured in Sherman crews who never came home, in vehicles reduced to smouldering steel by a weapon their own gun could not answer across any useful combat distance, in a doctrinal theory that proved itself fundamentally unequal to the enemy it was meant to defeat. When the M36 did arrive, the reaction from the crews who received it was immediate and unambiguous. The first M36 units entered combat in the autumn of 1944, assigned primarily to tank destroyer battalions attached to 1st and 3rd Army formations. By the end of the European campaign, over 1,136 vehicles had been produced, making it the most widely deployed vehicle carrying a 90mm gun in the American arsenal before the Pershing arrived in numbers. Crews who had been working with the lighter-gunned M10 and M18 immediately grasped what the new weapon gave them. They no longer had to manoeuvre for a flank shot they might never reach. They could engage from positions that the enemy had considered safe. The range advantage had shifted, and with it the dynamics of every engagement they entered. Here was a vehicle they could fight in. Here was a gun that gave them an answer to the question that had been killing them since Normandy. The 90mm cannon loaded quickly with a practiced crew, extracted reliably through its breech mechanism and the projectile it sent down Riyadh. Range travelled with the authority of a weapon designed specifically to kill the most dangerous armoured vehicles on the European battlefield. One of the most remarkable engagements involving the M36 was recorded in documentation that survives because the numbers in it were extraordinary. Lieutenant Alfred Rose, commanding an M36 tank destroyer, engaged a German armoured vehicle at an estimated range of 4,600 yards, that is more than 4 kilometres, 4,150 metres by European measurement. The German vehicle was destroyed. The engagement passed into the annals of armoured warfare as a demonstration of what the 90mm gun could accomplish in the hands of a trained crew operating with a clear line of sight, and the fire discipline to take a shot at a distance most crews would not have considered within their effective range. 4,600 yards. For context, a standard Sherman crewman in Normandy was being advised to close within 200 metres to have any reliable chance against a Panther's front plate. Alfred Rose killed his target from a distance that a Sherman crew would have considered not a combat range but a landscape. But the M36 was still a tank destroyer. Its armour was thin by tank standards. Its turret was open-topped, meaning the crew inside was exposed to artillery, shell fragments, small arms fire from buildings and ruins, and any aircraft that chose to investigate them. It was a weapon of deliberate fire support and patient ambush, valuable and effective in the role it was designed for, but its open crew compartment made it unsuitable for the kind of close urban fighting that the Allied advance increasingly demanded as the campaign drove deeper into Germany and into its cities. The weapon that solved that problem was already in development, and it had been in development for longer than most people realised. The M26 Pershing was the result of a program that had been fighting institutional resistance almost as long as the M36 itself. Named for General John Pershing, the commander of American expeditionary forces in the First World War, the M26 was a genuine heavy tank by American standards. It weighed 41 tons. It carried approximately 3 inches of frontal armour, roughly 90mm, on a well-sloped hull that gave the effective protection of a considerably thicker plate due to the angle at which projectiles would have to strike it. Its turret armour was comparable, and inside that turret sat the same 90mm cannon family mounted in the M36 Jackson, modified and refined for the specific mechanical demands of a tank's fighting role, with the critical difference of an enclosed crew compartment that protected the loader, gunner, and commander. From the battlefield environment, the M36's open turret could not exclude. McNair had died in Normandy in July of 1944, killed by friendly fire during an aerial bombardment supporting the Operation Cobra breakout near Saint-Lô. The circumstances were deeply ironic for a man who had spent years shaping the force that was fighting the campaign. With his death, the institutional resistance he had embodied began to erode. The weight of field reports, the visible and documented inadequacy of the Sherman against German heavy armour in the grinding battles of the autumn, and the approaching reality of the final drive into Germany combined to force the question that had been deferred for 2 years past the point where it could be deferred any longer. The Army sent the M26 Pershing to Europe. The first 20 vehicles arrived in January of 1945 and were distributed to units of the 1st United States Army. By February, they were in combat. The German intelligence system, for all its sophistication and thoroughness in other areas, had entirely missed this development. German tank commanders had compiled extensive technical documentation on the M4 Sherman. They knew its gun specifications. They knew its armour values. They had published reference materials for their own crews, showing precisely the engagement geometry needed to defeat the Sherman efficiently. They were confident in the arithmetic of that confrontation. What they were not confident about, because they did not know it was coming was a 41-ton American tank carrying a 90mm gun and frontal armour that their standard anti-tank ammunition could not reliably defeat at medium range. The Germans had correctly anticipated the capabilities of the Sherman based on captured vehicles and combat intelligence. They had not anticipated a category change. The M26 Pershing was not an improved Sherman. It was a different argument entirely. The engagement that defined the Pershing's arrival more sharply than any other took place in the city of Cologne on the 2nd of March, 1945. Cologne was the 4th largest city in Germany and one of its most ancient. Its cathedral, a Gothic structure of extraordinary height, begun in the 13th century and not completed until the 19th, its twin spires rising 157 metres above the city, had survived the bombing campaign that had reduced most of the surrounding neighbourhoods to rubble. As American infantry and armour fought street by street through the devastation, the cathedral rose above the broken landscape like a monument that the war had decided not to finish. The engagement in front of that cathedral has been captured on motion picture film taken by a United States Army Signal Corps cameraman who was present with the kind of timing that defines historical records. It is one of the most documented individual armoured engagements of the entire war in the West. The film exists. The names of the men are known. The vehicle identification numbers are recorded in unit histories. And the 46 seconds the footage preserves contain within them the story of everything the 90mm program had been designed to accomplish. Staff Sergeant Robert Early commanded the M26 Pershing involved in the engagement. His gunner was Corporal Clarence Smuyer. They were operating in a narrow urban corridor, moving cautiously through the kind of terrain where destroyed buildings created cover for defenders in every direction, and where the geometry of a street could conceal an opposing tank until the distance between them had narrowed to nothing. A German Panther tank appeared at the far end of the corridor. The Panther's crew fired first. The round struck the Pershing's gun mantler and failed to penetrate, deflecting away without breaching the armour that stood between it and the crew. This was the frontal protection doing exactly what the engineers had designed it to do. The German crew was not facing a Sherman. The mathematics of the engagement had changed in ways that the Panther's crew had no way to know, and Smuyer was already loading before the sound of the first impact had finished echoing off the ruins on either side of them. He aimed, he fired. The 90mm round struck the Panther, and the German tank was destroyed. 46 seconds beginning to end. The cameraman captured all of it, and that footage has been studied and shown for decades because it is a compression of everything that matters about the transition from the 75mm world to the 90mm world. The Panther crew fired first with a weapon that had been dominant since Normandy, and the round deflected. The American crew fired second with a weapon that had been 2 years in coming to the front, and the engagement ended in the only direction the 90mm gun made possible. A technical detail in the development of the Pershing's ammunition illuminates how thoroughly the program had been engineered. The 90mm armor-piercing round was not a simple steel projectile. American ordnance engineers had incorporated ballistic caps and armor-piercing caps into the projectile's construction, structures designed to manage the dynamics of the shell's contact with hardened, sloped steel plate. A plain steel tip striking angled armor at high velocity could shatter on impact or skate along the sloped surface without penetrating. A properly capped round was designed to grip the plate at the moment of contact and direct the penetrating force straight through the material rather than allowing the geometry of the slope to redirect the kinetic energy harmlessly downward. This distinction separated a weapon that performed well on a controlled range from a weapon that performed consistently in combat conditions against vehicles angled unpredictably and positioned in terrain that offered no ideal geometry. The contrast with what Sherman crews had been provided is not comfortable to examine. The American soldier in a Sherman in the summer of 1944 was not inadequately trained. He was not cowardly. He understood with absolute clarity the disparity between his weapon and what the enemy was sending against him. He was operating within the constraints of a procurement system that had delayed the answer to his problem for reasons that had everything to do with protecting a doctrine and nothing to do with his survival. McNair's doctrine did not survive the weight of what the battlefield taught the army in 1944. Its collapse was not sudden. It was an accumulation of evidence so heavy that no administrative structure could carry it any longer. The M36 continued in effective service through the end of the war, and in the open terrain of the Rhineland the gun proved its long-range capability repeatedly. The machine had been right all along, the data had been right all along, the engineers had been right all along. The question that history asks of the 2 years between the firing range proof and the frontline deployment does not have a comfortable answer. The M26 Pershing served beyond the war in Europe. Other Pershing crews made their own marks in the final weeks of the German campaign. At the Remagen bridgehead in March of 1945, Pershings provided critical fire support against German hull counterattack attempts, their 90mm guns engaging at ranges that kept enemy armor from closing on the bridge. In the final drive through central Germany in April, Pershing crews reported engagements with Tiger II tanks, the heaviest production armoured vehicle Germany produced, and found that while the King Tiger's frontal armour demanded precision and patience, the 90mm gun gave them options that the Sherman crews fighting alongside them did not have. The tank that had been 2 years in coming was performing in combat exactly as the firing range data from 1943 had said it would. In Korea, it met the Soviet-designed T-34 with considerably more success than the Shermans initially deployed there, which were briefly and dramatically outmatched in a pattern that should have surprised no one who'd studied what happened in 1944. The 90mm gun, in its various refined successors, became the standard Americans. Heavy armor armament through the 1950s. The development work done under pressure in 1942 and 1943, the ballistic testing that produced irrefutable data, the ammunition refinements that capped and strengthened the projectile for real combat conditions, all of it flowed forward into the generation that followed. The weapon that institutional resistance had tried to defer became the baseline. Clarence Smuyer survived the war and lived to speak about the Cologne engagement in later years. He described the mechanics of it with the clarity of a man who had thought carefully about what happened: the target appearing, the loading, the aim, the trigger pull, the impact. He described it as a job he had been trained to do in a vehicle he trusted, with a gun that worked. He did not describe it as a miracle. He described it as what happens when a crew knows their machine and the machine does what it was designed to do. That is the most precise summary of what the 90mm program ultimately achieved. Not a miracle, not a revelation that surprised anyone who'd read the data carefully since 1943. Just a weapon that worked, arriving at the front after a delay that should never have happened, in the hands of men who had been waiting for it longer than any of them should ever have had to wait. The Cologne Cathedral still stands. The film taken by the Signal Corps cameraman on the 2nd of March 1945 is preserved and publicly accessible, and somewhere in those 46 seconds of footage, between the Panther's round deflecting off American armour and Smuyer's round ending the engagement, is the entire argument the engineers had been making since 1942. They were right. They had always been right. It just took the full terrible weight of a 2-year delay and a long war to finally prove it to the men who had refused to listen.